Project Binky in colour. Starring Nick Blackhurst. Also starring Richard Brunning. And Rex Hamilton as Abraham Lincoln. Tonight's episode, A Bad Dream.
Are we on? Don't know if I can do this. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid we have to start episode 4 on a rather sombre note by announcing the passing of a good friend and valued member of the team here. An early death is always a tragedy, but it's made doubly difficult in this case by the fact it was only just out of guarantee. Kettle number 4, you will be missed. For about 10 minutes until we've got kettle number 5 up to speed. Business as usual then. Carry on.
Coming up on Project Binky, I get mildly irritated. Nick has a brain fart.
Right. Wank.
And he finally lets me loose with the grinder.
We're back at the front, and this time it is time to try and get this motor to fit. I've already stripped the wiring loom off it, keep it out of the way and stop it getting damaged, and already it doesn't look quite so scary. The first job is to get the engine and box level in both directions, and if you can remember this level plate from right back at the beginning of the project, this is where it comes in.
The engine is sitting on a couple of blocks of wood with bits of steel sheet and odd washers being used as shims to get it level and true. It sounds a bit Heath Robinson, but it works. Make the noise!
If you've ever wondered how sensitive these digital levels are, I'll show you.
No, I haven't wondered, Nick. I've read the manual, so I know how sensitive they are. Still, I suppose we should humour him for just a few seconds. Make the noise!
The next job is to trial fit it in the hole and try and get it square across the car.
So we've got it level in two planes sitting on the platform, but we need to make sure it's not skew across the car. With this piece of angle iron secured to the level plate by dowels, we can measure side to side and back to front to make sure we're in the right place. Yeah, that looks pretty close. The last job is to set the correct height in the chassis.
This is where the engine would be sitting relative to the suspension if it was still in the Celica.
Right, let's get the front end on and see where we're at. Yeah, not so good.
Clearly then, to have any hope of getting this thing under a standard Mini front end, it's got to go back a fair way. And if you're sitting there watching this thinking, that's easy, there's a bloody great hole and there's no bulkhead, go to the back of the class. Think about what you've said. If we move this thing back any further than the standard position, we're getting into all sorts of trouble with the steering rack and the anti-roll bar. The main limiting factor though is the angle of the drive shafts.
This is where the steering rack mounted on the Celica. We've got to replicate that to attach it to the Mini. So we've whipped out the front suspension negative jig thingy and added the upstands to accept the steering rack mount.
This is my interpretation of the steering rack mount panel, and in its standard position it fits on here. That's all very well and good, but it leaves me with a few problems. I can't pull the engine back into place because the negative suspension jig thing gets in the way. I can't attach the steering rack to it because the negative suspension jig thing gets in the way. And I'm pretty sure it's going to be in the way of the engine and gearbox. So I've come up with this to hopefully get around all these problems.
Tacking this new steering rack jig into position will allow us to remove the negative suspension jig thing and hopefully give us the room to push the engine back. This contraption gives us the ability to move the rack back up to 50mm, and we can slide it up and down 150mm. Now we can bolt the steering rack in and also mount the anti-roll bar. More metal's going to have to be cut from the front of the floor in order to clear the roll bar, so it's time to get out the grinder again. Now that Nick's chopped up even more of his nice new floor, the anti-roll bar fits fine. So, let's see if the engine fits.
Here we go. Trying to fit a 3S GTE engine in a Mini, take one.
The forwardmost point of the engine must be behind the line of the two chassis rails.
Bugger.
Drastic times call for drastic measures. So to get the engine back far enough, we're losing the power steering pump, the TVIS unit, the speedo drive, and part of the gear selector assembly. None of that stuff is important. It's only extra weight. We've also moved the rack up 100mm. Trying to fit a 3S GTE motor in a Mini, take 2. Now we're getting somewhere. Right, let's get the front end on and see if the engine is far back enough yet. Yep, that looks pretty good to me. Well, we've got the engine in the hole, as it were, but this is only the start of the headaches. It's not really in yet. There's the shafts and the steering to sort before we can say it's properly in. It's very, very tight in the engine bay. It's way too tight in places. As a result of bringing the engine back 115mm from its standard position relative to the suspension, the steering rack has had to be raised 100mm, and now the top of the transfer box is fouling it. The steering arms won't clear the bottom of the chassis legs, and to top it all off, the CV joints will foul the bottom arm mount. Oh, and the drive shaft will foul the anti-roll bar link. But instead of getting all down about it, Nick's fired up the grinder and hacked lumps out of his beautifully finished bottom arm mounts and chassis legs. He's also completely re-engineered the steering rack mount and insisted that I tell you that this rework alone took him 2 whole days. Man up, Blackhurst. To get the rack to clear the inlet manifold, we've come up with an incredibly clever and complicated fix. Yeah, that'll do it. Right, here we go again. It's time to bolt everything back on the Mini before trial fitting the motor once more. As we've raised the steering rack so far, we've had to make up some spaces to keep the ball joint in the right place and keep the bump steer to a minimum. We'll fashion a neater solution a bit later on.
Celica engine in a Mini, take 27. Seriously, I've had this thing in and out that many times I almost feel obliged to shake it all about.
I was going to give him a hand fitting the shafts, but quite honestly, it was fun watching him struggle time after time after time trying to get both ends fitted in one take with no snags. The extended director's cut version of this video will feature the 4 dozen or so attempts at getting this right. We're going to have to fit Aero-style CV joint boots for extra clearance later on, and we might have to fit a 5mm spacer behind the CV joint to minimise the angle as much as possible.
With all of the suspension components, the drive shaft and the steering rack in place, I need to start checking for clearance issues, but I need to do that over the full range of the wheel movement and not just on full droop where the suspension is now. To help with this, I've engineered a brilliant device that's going to help me keep the suspension at various levels where the wheel would ordinarily operate. I call it the Wheel Ordinary Operating Level device, or WOOD for short.
Right, that's enough of Nick's wood. Let's get on with the engine mountings.
This is the standard driver side Celica engine mount, and considering it's 25 years old, it's actually not in bad condition, but there's a couple of problems with it. Firstly, the centre hole is actually offset, it's a preloaded bush, so reverse engineering off it would be a bit of a nightmare. Secondly, there's just too many voids in it. Considering the gaps we're working with, I just think this will allow too much movement of the engine. We could change to a solid mount or a poly bush. They're both a bit harsh for a road car. So what I'm after is cheap, available, firm yet forgiving, and easily replaceable when they get old and saggy. Sounds like the ideal woman, but I'm actually talking about leaf spring bushes. These particular ones are off the back of a transit van, and all they need is a collar turning to take the inside down to the diameter we want, and then a collar making for the outside to take it from the Celica size bush down to the 50mm OD that these are.
Right, so it's the passenger side first, and it's the usual. CAD template, cut out the steel, and weld up the finished article. We've turned down a solid alley bush in place of the new rubber bush for the fabrication work, as we don't want to weld around the rubber. And there it is, fixed to the chassis leg. So that's the passenger side sorted, but the driver's side is just a little bit more troublesome. The standard Sleeker engine mount is large and cumbersome, and where we need the engine to be, it fouls on the strut tower. So we've had to make an extra slimmed down mount and massage the tower in order for it to fit where we need it to be. And there it is, welded to the Mini. The engine is finally hanging from its own mountings, unsupported from below. Okay, so the engine is bolted in, and the rear diff is bolted in, so the next thing to do is join the two together. And this means cutting out the tunnel in order to accept the prop shaft, and then making a new tunnel big enough to house it. That'll give us plenty of room. Okay, so now we've got the tunnel out, we can have a closer look at the prop shaft conundrum. So the prop shaft is the bit that connects the transfer box here to the diff at the back, and it's a pretty fundamental part of a four-wheel drive system, so we've got to make sure we get this absolutely right. So as you can see, this prop is way too long. We can't use it because the design of it means we can't modify it. So we've got a couple of choices. I do love him, but sometimes he's a colossal trumpet. So as I was saying, we've got a couple of choices. We can have one made, or make one, or we can try and find one off another car that we can modify to fit this one. We've chosen a prop out of a Lexus IS200, because as we were looking through the breakers yard, it kind of looked about the right length. So we'll get it in and see how much modification we have to do. Lexus is part of the Toyota family, so we hoped the spline and drive flanges would match the original Celica stuff.
I was going to give him a hand fitting the prop shaft, but given what he said earlier about the drive shafts, bollocks to him.
Now with a bit of luck, this is a similar spline. Oh, look at that! Like I bought one. Right, that's one end. Let's see how long it's going to be. Right, how much length?
Talk about dragging the job out. This isn't just making a meal of the job, this is a romantic 3-course meal for 2, with coffee liqueur afterwards and the possibility of a fumble later on.
So this Lexus IS200 prop is exactly the right length, off the shelf. Nobody is going to believe us. But I swear, no modifications have been made, it slid straight in the transfer box, and on the diff, it's exactly the right length. We needed some luck, and that was it. Now we'll support the centre bearing and bolt it up. And as our demonstration proves, all 4 wheels on the car are turning for the very first time.
I'm guessing you're not believing a word of that, because I'm here and I don't believe it. So I think the best thing to do before I shoot off and do the lottery is put a tunnel over it and say no more about it.
Right, so the next job is make a new tunnel. As ever, we'll start with some flat sheet. Then we'll put some bends in it, and we do that with a piece of angle iron, some clamps, a long bit of tube with the right diameter, and a hoofing great big press. A little while later, you end up with this. The extra step in the tunnel is to allow us to run the exhaust pipe alongside the prop shaft. I think it's high time we got this tunnel welded into the shell. Could we say that there's now light at the end of the tunnel? No? I'll get my coat.
Now that the tunnel's welded in, I can finish off fitting our Miracle prop by fixing the centre bearing. And to do that, I've made a hanger bracket off the centre bearing carrier, and this will weld to a strengthening plate I've already welded to the inside of the tunnel.
Right, let's get this thing bolted in.
Now I can start tying the 2 different rear floor levels together using these 2 drop plates. With the rear floor pan sorted, I can now finish off the inner sill with these 2 plates.
While Nick gets on with the welding, I'm going to get the funk out. Right, that's enough funking around. Here's the completed plating. Lovely, isn't it? Got to plate up this gap in the middle now. And here's the plate we're going to use. That plate's a pretty snug fit. With the centre section welded into place, we can cut off the top support brace and gently hammer it out. So the back end of the floor is looking pretty damn good now.
I'm not entirely convinced that this piece is strong enough. I can't give it any more depth, so I'm going to use this piece to double up the thickness instead.
That looks like an awful lot of plug weld holes to me. Yep, I was right.
The plan is to extend these rear chassis rails a bit further into the car, but I don't want to do that until the rear seat's in. I'll clean all this back after I've welded it from underneath for a bit more strength. So for now, that's the rear part of the floor finished.
It's not exactly 24 karat gold plating, but it's pretty damn good plating nonetheless.
Staying with the floor and moving forwards, the next job is to put back the seat boxes.
So here's the original floor with the rotten seat boxes, and it's clear that we can't use any of this. There was no point in buying new ones, as we just have to cut them up because of the new tunnel. And making our own means that we can make the front part out of 2mm steel for a bit of extra strength, and the rest of it out of 1mm. Time to get funky! So there we have it. The rear of the floor is finished and the new seat boxes are in. So we'll leave it there for now. But before we do, let's take stock of our running gear. We've got the Mahusiv 2-litre turbocharged engine, we've got the gearbox, and the transfer box, and the prop shaft, and the rear diff. We've also got the front suspension, and the rear suspension, 4 drive shafts, and the steering rack. It's all in. So, tune in to the next exciting episode to hear me say,
This is all box, by the way.